Most people think that intermittent fasting is this magic pill and it's going to magically help them lose weight. It's going to magically help them get super fit and get these six-pack abs. And there's a good reason why. A lot of good things can happen when you stop eating. And we have a lot of data that supports this because most people simply eat too much. Now, while intermittent fasting has a lot of benefits, I think that there are some serious downsides that most people simply don't know about. And this is especially true if you're doing fasting for a long period of time. And once I realized a lot of these downsides, I realized that fasting, especially for a long period of time, wasn't for me. Now, one of the biggest problems with intermittent fasting is it's really hard to get enough protein when you're fasting for a long period of time. And also for some people, fasting can actually have the opposite effect of what you're going for. So now instead of losing weight and losing fat, you're actually going to end up gaining fat and losing lean muscle mass. Now, one of the reasons for this is some people simply don't do fasting correctly. It's really easy when someone breaks their fast to start overindulging on your food. So for example, let's say you didn't eat for a whole day and now you can finally have that first meal. But instead of eating a normal meal like you normally would, now you're going to have a huge meal plus half a tub of ice cream. So now in this situation, not only are you overindulging on a ton of junk food, you're also not getting enough nutrients. So this is how your body composition can kind of change and go from instead of losing fat to actually gaining fat and losing muscle. Now, I'm not saying that everyone does fasting this way. Some people actually do fasting correctly and they might actually lose weight. But even in those situations, even if you do fasting correctly, I still think that there's a ton of downsides. And for a lot of people, that the downsides will actually outweigh the benefits that you get. Now, I do think that there are some situations where people can benefit from fasting and they actually should be fasting for some time. But I think for most people, they should do fasting as a temporary fix and not a long-term way of doing their diet. So for example, one way to do this as a temporary fix, and again, I'm going to get more into detail on the different types of fasting and who should actually be doing fasting later on. But one example is a time-restricted eating window. So this is one really popular type of fasting where every day some people have this eating window where they only eat from this time to this time, let's say 6 hours in the day. And then for the rest of that whole day, they're not eating anything. And this is actually a way of fasting that I practiced and the one that I actually stopped recently. So this can be great for people who are constantly snacking throughout the day or people who are eating meals in the middle of the night because they get too hungry, or people who are just having really a ton of processed food. So basically the standard American diet. If you restrict your eating window so that you're only eating at a certain point in the day, then it's going to basically prevent you from snacking at different times and cut out a lot of that junk from your diet. So in this way, fasting can be good because it can stop a lot of that mindless random eating that a lot of people do and cut out a lot of that junk from their diet. But that's about it. And I think once you see a lot of the downsides that you can get from intermittent fasting, you might actually change your mind as well. Specifically, I think that the long-term muscle loss you get from intermittent fasting is worse off than the benefits you get from restricting your calories. Protein is the biggest nutrient that people lack when they get older. And any time in medicine, any type of intervention or any drug that people are administrating, we always have to look at the benefits and the risks. And we have to see if the benefits of something will outweigh the risks. And this is where something like intermittent fasting, where I think that the risks will actually outweigh the benefits. Because like I said before, you do not get enough protein when you are doing intermittent fasting. Right now, the RDA, or the recommended daily amount of protein in your diet, is about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So let's say you weigh 170 pounds, and that in kilograms is going to be 77 kilograms. So that would equate to you needing 62 grams of protein in a day. Now, what they don't tell you is that is not enough protein. That is hardly enough protein. That's enough for you to survive, but that's about it. That's not enough for you to build and maintain enough lean muscle. Now, ideally, you're going to want to try to get 2 to 3 times that RDA of protein. So now if you weigh 170 pounds, instead of going for 62 grams of protein, which is what's recommended, you're going to want to try to get anywhere from 124 to 186 grams of protein. So another way of looking at this is try to get 1 gram per 1 pound of your body weight of your protein. And this is actually what's recommended for people who are trying to build muscle. Now, again, I'm going to go back to fasting. There is simply not enough time in the day if you were doing intermittent fasting to get enough of this protein, because ideally, you're going to want to spread it out over 4 courses. So in a typical 16-8 fast, which is where people are fasting 16 hours a day and only eating 8 hours out of the day, there's no way you're going to be able to spread out 4 courses of protein to get enough protein in that 8-hour eating window. Now, if you combine that with your resistance training or working out, which you should be doing if you're trying to build lean muscle, it's going to be really hard to build lean muscle and even maintain lean muscle by doing this fasting. Now, why am I so concerned about muscle? I'm not telling you to become a bodybuilder or some power lifter or anything like that, but your muscle, and specifically your muscle strength, is still very important. And actually, muscle strength is one of the greatest indicators we have for your longevity. So in other words, your muscle strength, or how strong you are, will help determine how long you will live and also how healthy you will live. And some of the best data we have on this is actually your grip strength. So how hard you can actually squeeze something. And that's a very good indicator for your overall longevity and your health span, or your overall lifespan. Now, one reason specifically that muscle is so important, especially when you get older, is that it can prevent you from falling. If you are able to have enough muscle to stand and stabilize your body and walk properly, you're going to have a much less chance of falling. Let's say you're walking in the middle of the night, or you were trying to go to the bathroom or something. You're going to have a much less chance of falling down and hurting yourself. Now, surprisingly, as people get older, the biggest reasons for accidental deaths is falling, literally falling down. And this is according to the CDC. And this is also excluding people who fall down and then they have a serious fall, but they don't die from it, but they die later in the hospital because of some other serious issue. According to the CDC, 800,000 elderly people are in the hospital every single year because of a fall. Now, this is why I think that muscle is so important, especially when you focus on it early on, because one of the prime landmarks of aging is losing and deteriorating your muscle and your bones. Every decade that goes on in our life, we start to lose muscle and we start to get weaker and weaker bones. So now imagine if you're falling off a ladder at the age of 25 or 30 and you break a bone or something like that. It's probably not going to be a big deal and you're probably going to heal just fine. Now imagine doing the same thing if you're 75. Now you can start to see the difference here. If you have more muscle, especially later on in life, this is going to help protect your bones. And having more muscle is highly correlated with a lower risk of falling. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you're stronger, you're less likely to fall down. And not only are you less likely to fall down, you're less likely to get hurt if you do fall down, because your muscle is part of your exoskeleton, which basically means outside of your bones. And it's there to help protect your bones. So having more muscle will mean that you're less likely to get injured when you actually do fall. Now also, not only will having enough muscle prevent you from falling down and prevent you from getting hurt if you do fall down, it'll also improve your quality of life. A lot of times, as people get older, they're not able to do a lot of the things that they like to do when they were younger. They're not able to go hiking. They're not able to go on walks. They're not really able to move as well. And this all comes down, again, partially to how much muscle they have. And if they have more muscle and more muscle strength, they're going to be more likely to be able to do these things. This is why it's so important to take action early on to make sure that you have enough muscle, to make sure that you're eating enough protein to be able to build enough lean muscle mass. And this is why having enough protein is super important. One thing to know about protein is that it is different from carbohydrates and fat. And one way that it's different is we don't use protein as a primary source of energy like we do carbs and fat. If you look at our cells and if you look at our mitochondria, they're actually able to break down our glucose or our carbohydrates and our fat cells and turn them into ATP, which is our body's energy. Our body doesn't do that with our protein. And also, we store protein differently than we store fat and carbohydrates. Instead of storing it as excess fat and actually making us fatter, excess protein will actually go get excreted in our urine. So we'll actually pee it out. And also, protein is just super important. Protein is the building blocks for all of our muscles, our enzymes, and a lot of the different hormones that are important for our body. Having enough protein is also important for our immune system, having healthy skin, healthy nails, healthy hair. All of these things rely on having enough protein. Now, when you think about protein, you also have to think about amino acids, because amino acids are the building blocks of protein. And we have 20 different types of amino acids. Now, the thing with these amino acids is 9 of them are called essential amino acids, meaning we have to get 9 of these amino acids in our diet. We cannot produce them on our own. The other 11 we're producing just fine on our own. So in our diet, we have to focus on those 9 essential amino acids. Now, a lot of people also wonder if the type of protein that they're eating matters. There's different types like animal-based protein, which is eating meat. There's also whey protein. There's also plant-based protein. So all of these different types of protein are still protein, but how are they acting in your body? Do they act the same way? That's the question. In a nutshell, just know that you can eat any type of protein that you want and it will still do benefits in your body. But one thing to note is that plant protein is not going to be as bioavailable as animal protein. And the reason is plant protein is there for the benefit of the plant, not for the human. And the reason for that is a lot of these plant proteins are full of these indigestible fibers, meaning they're less bioavailable for us. So meaning it's harder for us to get protein from these plant proteins. So this was actually looked at by a guy named Don Layman, who's an expert on protein and also a professor on food science. And he found that only 60 to 70% of the protein that you get from plants is actually going to get into your body. So whatever protein you're eating from plants, just know that you have to eat a little bit more of that protein to get the same amount of protein that you're going to get from an animal product. So one way of getting around this plant protein is actually cooking it. And if you cook it, then you can get away with a lot of this indigestible stuff that's in the plant protein. But the other issue with plant-based protein is its distribution of amino acids. You don't get as much of a distribution of those essential amino acids, which you have to get from your diet, in plant protein when you compare it to animal-based protein. Specifically, plant protein has less methionine, lysine, and tryptophan. Those are 3 of the essential amino acids that you do not get as much from plant protein. So if you're eating a lot of plant proteins, you want to make sure you try to supplement these 3 amino acids. Because if you're not getting enough of these amino acids, it's going to lead to less protein synthesis. So it's going to be harder for your body to make more proteins. So it's going to make it a lot harder for you to build lean muscle. So in general, if you look at animal-based protein versus plant-based protein, there is no denying that plant-based protein is not as good quality compared to animal-based protein. But you can still make it work if you're eating plant-based protein. Now, what about protein supplements? Like there's whey protein, there's soy protein. It seems like whey protein, which is protein from dairy, is better than soy protein. Now, sorting through all this can get really confusing really quickly, because now you have to look at not only what are you eating and how much protein you're getting, you have to look at how much of this protein is actually getting absorbed into my body and how much of this protein contains these essential amino acids. So Don Layman, again, that expert on protein, made this a little bit easier. And he said that you should focus on 3 different amino acids. Those 3 are leucine, lysine, and methionine. So every meal that you're eating, you want to focus on these 3 amino acids and see if you're getting enough of those in your diet. You want to try to get 3 to 4 grams of this leucine and lysine in a day, and you want to try to get at least 1 gram of methionine in a day. And this is if you want to at least maintain your lean muscle mass. But if you're trying to actually increase your muscle mass, then you want to increase one of these amino acids in particular, and that is your leucine. Now you want to try to get 2 to 3 grams of this per serving 4 times a day. So now you're going to try to get 8 to 12 grams of this in a day. Now, some people have this impression that if you want to live longer, that you need to have a more low protein diet. Now, actually, a lot of this hype from this notion came from studies on mice, not actually studies on humans. And if you look at studies on mice, they show that if you restrict protein in mice, it can actually help them live longer. But now if you look at the data on humans, you will see the exact opposite. And actually, if you increase protein consumption in humans, it'll actually help them live longer. And at the same time, if you see studies in humans, they'll consistently show that if they have lower amount of protein in their diet, they'll have lower lean muscle mass, and they'll have a greater risk of dying, and also a worse quality of life overall. We actually have multiple studies showing that when elderly people are eating the recommended amount of protein in a day, which again is simply not enough, that they'll actually start to lose lean muscle mass in as quickly as 2 weeks. And again, we've seen multiple times that one of the greatest indicators for how long you'll live is how much muscle you'll have, and specifically how much muscle strength you'll have. So if these elderly people are losing muscle that quickly, we can see that whatever's recommended for the amount of protein right now is simply not enough. We need more in our diet. And another study was actually looking at adding protein to elderly people's diets and seeing if they could actually gain lean muscle mass. So this study was looking at 62 different seniors, and they were doing strength training for a total of 6 months. So half the group did not have any added protein in their diet, and the other half actually had a protein supplement in addition to their diet. So the group that did not have any protein supplement, they actually did not gain any lean muscle mass, even after 6 weeks of training. The other group that actually had the protein added via a protein shake, they actually added 3 pounds of lean muscle mass after the 6 months. And we'll see similar results across a lot of different studies as well. So another study was actually looking at just barely increasing the protein intake above the daily recommended amount. And just doing that will actually slow elderly people's muscle loss. Another study was looking at frail elderly people, and they added 30 grams of protein supplement to their diet, and they actually improved their physical performance. Now, you might be wondering, why am I focusing so much on studies on elderly people? Well, I think it's important to focus here because elderly people have a harder time building muscle compared to younger people. So if you give the same anabolic stimulus and you give the same amount of amino acids to a younger person versus an older person, the older person is going to have a lot harder time building that muscle. So this is why I think it's super important to focus on these types of studies. And also, I think in terms of longevity and how long you can actually live, I think it's really important to focus on elderly people because this is where having enough muscle is most important. Again, it's going to be important in improving your quality of life and preventing falling and also preventing injury. So again, how much protein should you be eating? Well, I recommend trying to get 2 to 3 times whatever is the recommended daily amount right now. So again, the recommended daily amount right now is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. I think you should try to up that to 1 gram per 1 pound of body weight. Or in other words, that's 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, some of you might be wondering how much protein is too much. Like if I'm eating 3 times whatever the RDA is, at some point my kidneys are going to give out or something's going to happen where I'm eating too much protein. Well, I can tell you that it's extremely hard to eat too much protein. And if you eat 2 to 3 times the RDA right now of protein, you're not going to be getting anywhere near eating too much protein. Now, if you want to be safe, definitely make sure you ask your doctor and see if your kidneys are okay and make sure that you can handle that extra protein. But just so you know, the upper limit of protein consumption is 3.7 grams per kilogram or 1.7 grams per pound of body weight. So now let's say that you weigh 170 pounds. Now you have to eat about 289 grams of protein just to get to that upper limit of your protein intake. That is extremely hard to do. So again, this is why I stopped my intermittent fasting, because there is no way that I was going to be able to get enough of this protein in my diet if I was doing my intermittent fasting or my restricted eating window. And the second reason that I stopped my fasting is because I'm a relatively active person. So I try to work out or do some type of exercise about 5 to 6 days in a week. So I just feel like my protein intake compared with my output was not enough. So that's why I completely abolished that. So an ideal way to eat this protein in your diet is over the course of 4 meals. So the way I typically do this is I eat a high protein snack. Then for lunch, I'll have chicken or some other high protein meal. Then after I work out, I'll have a protein shake. And then for dinner, I'll have another meal that's relatively high in protein. And just doing that, I'll get enough protein in my day. And when it comes to your other nutrients like your carbohydrates and your fat, I really don't think you need to worry too much about them because I think those will naturally come in your diet and you'll naturally get enough of those in your diet. For most people, I think the biggest mistake in their diet is they're simply lacking enough protein. I thought I was eating enough protein until I actually looked at my diet when I was intermittent fasting, and I said that I was only getting about 80 grams of protein, and I weigh about 175 to 180 pounds. So I needed to up that about 100 grams to get to my goals. Just kind of further emphasizing this, I think that literally the more protein you eat, the better. And it's basically virtually impossible in a normal diet to eat too much protein unless you're actually trying to eat too much protein. So there's actually a study called the Health ABC study, or the Health, Aging, and Body Composition study. And it was looking at 2,000 adults over the course of 3 years. They found that the people in that study that ate the most protein, and that was consisting about 18% of their total calories, they had the most muscle mass retained over the course of the 3 years. And this is compared to people on the lowest end of the protein consumption. And actually, the group that had the lowest amount of protein in their diet, they lost a whopping 40% more lean muscle mass compared to the group that had the highest amount of protein. And we've seen countless times in countless studies that having more muscle is better because it not only helps you live longer, it also improves your quality of life. Now, another benefit you get from protein is that it can actually improve your metabolism. So one study was looking at elderly people, and they gave them protein that had these essential amino acids into it. And over time, they actually lowered their levels of liver fat and also their circulating triglycerides. So basically, their metabolism improved overall. Now, another study was looking at people who have mild to moderate alcohol dependence, meaning they pretty much drink alcohol every single day. After giving these people additional protein, they found that they had a 50% reduction in their liver fat after just 4 weeks. Now, if you don't already know, if you drink alcohol, it can do a lot of damage to your liver, and specifically by building up more fats in your liver. And this is a disease called fatty liver disease. So if you know someone, or if you are a person that drinks a lot and they can't help but stop and you're trying to quit, one thing you can do is try to up your protein intake, and this can kind of mitigate some of the damage that's going on in your liver. Now, obviously, you don't want to up your protein intake and also up all the intake of your other foods. You want to try to keep your calorie count the same, just increase the percentage of protein that's in your diet. Now, another study was looking at people with type 2 diabetes, and they doubled their protein intake at the expense of their carbohydrates. So their protein intake went from 15 to 30% of their total calories, and their carbohydrate percentage dropped in half. And they actually found that they improved their ability to control their glucose and also improved their insulin sensitivity. So eating more protein helped people with diabetes to get to a safer level. And lastly, with protein, it can actually help you feel more full. So eating more protein will actually inhibit the hormone called ghrelin. Now, this is your hunger hormone. So anytime you're hungry, that's your ghrelin hormone that's acting and basically signaling you to start eating. And if you inhibit that, you're going to be less likely to feel hungry, and you're not going to want to eat as much. Now, I know I said I would start talking about intermittent fasting and why I exactly quit, and I'm hoping you guys can kind of start to see why, because that was basically the biggest reason for me, which was protein and not having enough protein in my diet. So that being said, who should be doing intermittent fasting? Intermittent fasting is great for people who are metabolically unhealthy, because for these people who are in this category of extremely metabolically unhealthy, then it's going to be better for them to lose weight, even if they're losing some of their lean muscle, because overall they're still going to be healthier. Now, the main benefit you get from intermittent fasting is you're cutting calories. So there's really 3 ways to start cutting your calories. One is to just do a calorie restriction, where every meal you're focusing on your diet and you're eating less portion. And actually, out of the 3 different ways to cut calories, we have the best evidence on simply cutting calories each meal. Now, the second way is cutting out a part of your diet. So for some people, that might mean becoming a vegetarian and cutting out all the meat in their diet. For other people, that might mean just cutting out all carbs, and you'll see people going on these keto diets or these diets where they're cutting out all bread. As long as you're not increasing calories of everything else, that's another way to start cutting calories. Now, the third way is a time-restricted form of eating, and that is, in other words, intermittent fasting. Now, like I said, the best evidence we have is for calorie restriction, where you're just cutting out calories every single meal. But this is also the hardest way to cut calories, because over time, you might start to feel hungry and you might start to overindulge on different foods. But the easiest way to start cutting calories is intermittent fasting. Now, Now, one of the benefits you get from cutting calories, for example, by doing fasting, is your insulin levels will drop. Because when you're fasting, you're not eating. So there's no food coming in to trigger any sort of insulin response. So for someone that has some sort of metabolic disorder, for example, like type 2 diabetes, where your insulin is getting less and less sensitive, meaning your insulin is not working as well, this can be a great way to try to get back in the right track. Fasting can also help empty out fat from the liver and enter a state called starvation ketosis. This is basically where over time your body starts breaking down more fat and help you lose fat. And also when you start breaking down more fat, you have more of these ketones that start circulating throughout your body, and this can also turn down your hunger. So having more of these ketones will actually make you less hungry and make it easier for you to start eating less. And another benefit from fasting is it can actually turn down something called mTOR. mTOR is basically this protein complex that is involved in our cells, and it has a lot of important functions. So basically the role of mTOR is to monitor our nutrients and see how much incoming food there is, and to either signal our cells to go into a growth phase or to start going into a recycling phase. So if you have a ton of food coming in, then mTOR gets activated and it says that we need to start growing and building new proteins. And this is where the growth phase kicks in. But at the same time, if you start fasting and you don't have any nutrients coming in, then mTOR gets suppressed. And now instead of building and growing, now it's going to start recycling old cells, because basically it's trying to get your cells to start conserving energy. And we have a lot of studies that show that when you turn down this mTOR signaling, that it can actually promote you to live longer. And also another benefit you get from intermittent fasting is you get more autophagy, which is basically cellular recycling, which is basically going to make your cells more efficient and also make your cells more resilient to different diseases and also promote you to live longer and healthier. And also fasting can help activate something called FOXO, which are basically these cellular repair genes that you have that can help you live longer as well. Now that being said, I know we get all these benefits from fasting and benefits from not eating. I still think it's only beneficial for people who have very severe metabolic problems. Now, when it comes down to fasting, there are 3 types of fasting. So one is intermittent fasting, where you're basically restricting your eating window in a restricted time in a single day. The second type is alternate day fasting. And the third type is a hypocaloric fast. So I'm going to go over all 3 of these types of fasting in detail, so stick around. So again, the first type of fasting is shortening your eating window. So when you're shortening your eating window, there's really a ton of different variations of doing this. And there's no right or wrong way of doing this. A typical way of doing this is a 16-8 fast. Or in other words, where you're fasting for 16 hours of the day and you're eating only in 8 hours out of the day. So one way to do this is to fast until noon and then have your first meal and then eat again closer to 8 p.m. And that's all the eating that you're going to do in a day. The way that I used to do this was more of a 17-7 type of fast, where I would fast until about 1 p.m. where I'd have my first meal, and then I'd eat again at around 7 p.m. And then that would be all the eating that I do in that day. And there wasn't a particular reason why I did this. It was more just to fit my work schedule. But again, as I said before, I stopped doing this recently. Now, the thing with this type of fasting is it only works if you make the eating window small enough. So you don't want to make it any longer than 8 hours. So if you're trying to get the benefits from this fasting and you extend that eating window beyond 8 hours, then you really don't get any of the benefits from it. And actually, if you want to get enough of a calorie deficit, then you might even want to go a little bit smaller. You might want to go down to a 6-hour eating window. And some people even go down to a 4-hour or a 2-hour eating window. And in these situations, you're really only going to have 1 meal in a day. Now, if you're trying to get a calorie deficit, this is probably one of the easiest ways to do it, because you're not really focusing on what you're eating. Now you're just focusing on when you're eating. So you look at the clock and you say, it's time to eat. Then you can eat whatever you want. Then you can go back to doing your business. As long as you are in your eating window, you can eat. And if you're not in your eating window, you can't eat. Now, one gripe I have about this shortened eating window is that it really became popular after studies on mice. And that's actually how this 16-8 model became so popular. So they would feed these mice in an 8-hour eating window, and then these mice would fast for 16 hours out of the day. But the problem is that mice are very different than humans. A mouse will only live about 2 to 3 years, and they can survive only about 48 hours without eating. Now compare that to a human. We can survive about 30 days without eating. So a 16-hour fast in a mouse is equivalent to doing multiple days of fasting in a human. And actually, if you look at the studies on humans in this type of fasting where they do this 16-8 eating window, then you'll see that there's not a whole lot of good data supporting it. So there's one study from 2020 where they took 116 volunteers and they had them do a 16-8 fast. So they would only eat in 8 hours out of their day, and they didn't really find any benefits from doing it. They didn't find any weight loss or any metabolic benefits compared to the control group. And if you look at other studies, they'll find something similar as well. Now, one interesting thing is you might actually get benefit from doing this if you shift your eating window earlier. So some studies are showing that when you actually shift this eating window earlier, so for example, if you do an 8 a.m. to a 2 p.m. fast, now you can actually lower your glucose and your insulin levels. So one reason for this could be because your body is simply more insulin sensitive in the morning. So that means that your body can simply react to incoming carbohydrates and sugars better in the morning. So if you want to start to eat more carbohydrates, it's actually better to do this in the mornings because this is where your body can try to take control of that better. But that being said, if you look at the studies show that it's better when you fast for a longer period of time. So we're going to get into the other types of fasting. But in general, I think that this type of fasting is a good way to get in the right track. So if you do this time-restricted eating window correctly, it's a great way to kind of kick off your diet and try to start in the right direction because it'll really help you control a lot of the mindless snacking and a lot of the mindless junk foods that you're eating, which is a really big part of our standard American diets now, like chips or different crackers or different snacks like that. So I think it's a great way to get in the right direction, but I think that there's a lot more that you could be doing. So the second type of fasting is an alternate day fast. So this is another really popular one. And basically this involves eating a normal amount one day, or sometimes even eating a little bit below a normal amount one day. Then the second day, you're not eating anything, you're just drinking water. And you're kind of alternating every day like this. So the research on this type of fasting actually looks better than the research on the shortened eating window. And one reason for that is simply because you're fasting for a longer period of time. So you get a lot of those benefits that we mentioned earlier of not eating. But one thing I want to focus on with alternate day fasting is you want to make sure you're not losing any lean muscle when you do it this way. Because if you start to lose lean muscle, then I think that it's time to either abandon or change your course of fasting. Because if you look at all the studies on alternate day fasting, yeah, there's a lot of evidence that you can lose weight, but there's also some evidence that you can start to lose muscle. And this is when you compare alternate day fasting with people who simply cut calories every single meal, but still eat every single day. So if that sounds like you and you're starting to lose muscle and you're doing this alternate day fasting, you might want to switch over to eating every day, but just cutting your calories. I know that might be a little bit harder, but it's also really important to maintain that muscle. And the second problem with this alternate day fasting is you want to make sure that you can still do your activities on the days that you're fasting. Because again, if you look at the studies, you'll see that a lot of people simply do not have as much energy on the days that they're fasting. And actually, these effects get more pronounced when you do even longer fasts. So people who do longer day fasts, like multiple days at a time, they tend to have less and less activity as the days go on when they're not eating. And actually, the effects of losing muscle also increase the longer you fast. So if you increase your fast from 1 day to 2 days to 3 days, then you're gonna risk losing more and more muscle. So I think for anyone that's trying to start fasting, I think they should really focus on still eating enough so that they're getting enough protein, but also make sure that they're still able to do activity when they're fasting. If you're fasting to the point where you can hardly move or you don't have any energy at all, I think it's time for you to start eating a little bit more or change your type of fast. Now, the third type of fasting is a hypocaloric fasting. So this one is not a traditional fast per se because you're still eating. But basically an example of this is, let's say you have 30 days. And out of 5 days, out of those 30 days, you're going to be in a very hypocaloric mode, meaning you're eating very little compared to the other days. So you're eating enough just to quench any of the extreme hunger pains, but that's about it. You're not eating to the point where you feel satiated at all. So this is kind of like a form of calorie restriction, but it's basically very extreme way of restricting your calories in just a very short time frame. Now, this is a little bit easier than calorie restriction in general because you're not doing it for a long period of time. You just have to get through that 1 week or those 5 days in the month, and you're still eating a little bit, so it's not like you're fasting. And then after those 5 days are up, you can go back to eating like normal. Overall, I think that no matter what type of fasting you're doing, it's fine and it has its place, but obviously some types are better than others, and we kind of went over that a little bit. But I think that if you are metabolically healthy and you're not really trying to lose weight, but you want to at least maintain lean muscle, or you want to try to build lean muscle, then you should definitely avoid fasting at all costs. If anything, I think that fasting should be a temporary way to kind of fix your diet and get out a lot of that junk food and try to get you back on the right track, but that's about it. Fasting for most people, I don't think should be a long-term focus. Now, if you are very metabolically unhealthy, this is where I think fasting can have a lot of benefits, but you want to make sure that you're fasting correctly. So you don't want to break your fast by eating a ton of junk food and eating a ton of food that you normally wouldn't eat. When you're breaking your fast, you want to have a normal meal. And that's the whole point of fasting, because now you're cutting your calories. Because if you're eating normally 3 meals in a day, but now you cut it down to 2 meals in a day, but you don't increase the portion of either of those 2 meals, then you just effectively cut out a whole meal from your diet. And now you're just basically restricted your calories that amount. And I think that if you are a metabolically unhealthy person, this can really help you get on the right track, because now you can start to control your insulin levels, and now you can start to get your metabolism working again to where now you might not have to do this fast for a long period of time, but at least for that time to get in the right track, then you can do that fasting. Because people who are metabolically unhealthy, they are very insulin resistant, meaning their insulin in their body simply does not work that well. So if they eat sugar or they eat carbohydrates, it's going to be way more likely to get stored as fat. They're going to have a way harder time of burning fat. And also they're going to have a higher and higher insulin release and be more at likelihood of getting type 2 diabetes. But for the rest of people, I think that the risk of fasting simply outweighs the benefits that you get. I think the risk of losing muscle and not being able to build new lean muscle will outweigh the benefits that you get from periods of calorie restriction. The thing is that intermittent fasting will work for a lot of people because most Americans are simply not metabolically healthy. And this goes into the whole standard American diet and people snacking on foods throughout the day and having a more lazy lifestyle where they're not working out. So for a lot of people, fasting will still work. So I don't want to discourage you from doing it if it's working from you. Just remember that no matter what, if you are fasting or if you're not fasting, the most important nutrient that you need to focus on is your protein. And this is the most important nutrient that a lot of people are forgetting to add in their diets, and this is the biggest nutrient that people are lacking in their diets, especially as they get older. So no matter what, make sure you focus on your protein and make sure you're getting enough protein and getting a lot of those essential amino acids in your meals. Most people do eat too much food, but they still don't eat enough protein. Modern medicine has advanced a lot, but it still sucks at preventing chronic diseases like cancer. But it doesn't have to be that way. I'll show you. Right now, about 40% of people will get cancer at some point in their life. And when it comes down to preventing cancer, unfortunately, there's still a lot we do not know. Our best bet right now